Perfect. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for the first ever town hall with Canada's first ever federal housing advocate, Marie-Josée Houle. This really is a momentous occasion for the right to housing movement, for advocates across the housing and homelessness sector, and for people across the country who are experiencing homelessness and inadequate housing, but until now had no form of justice to claim their basic human right to housing. But before I get ahead of myself, we'd like to ensure that everyone has a barrier-free experience at today's event. So just a few housekeeping pieces. Captioning is available for this event. So to add, you need to go to the bottom bar of Zoom, hit the three dots that say more, and then click show subtitles, and you should have access to those captions. We also have French interpretation available, so that is from the interpretation button at the bottom of Zoom. We have ASL interpreters or sign language interpreters in both English and French pinned to the screen. And if you need any technical support, you can reach out to our wonderful colleague, Matthew Wu, and I believe there is an ask for help button at the bottom of Zoom as well, or you can just put your issue in the chat and we will address it. I also encourage everyone to ensure that your name is updated on your Zoom handle and that you include your pronouns. So you can do this by clicking the three dots at the top right corner of your name and updating it by clicking rename. And finally, I should flag that this town hall is being recorded so that we can make it available as an online resource after the event. And so if you would like to not have your image or personal details on that recording, you are welcome to keep your camera off, to anonymize any personal details, and then of course to use the chat function to voice your questions and comments. And speaking of the chat, we really encourage everyone to share their thoughts and questions in the chat throughout the event. We have tons of folks here today, which is incredible, but we also recognize that everyone may not get a chance to address the advocate directly, but her office will get the entire chat log after the event and will review all of your comments and questions. So that's a great place to engage today and to have your comments preserved. And in fact, to start it all off, I would love to invite everyone to introduce yourself and where you're calling from in the chat now. And I will also introduce myself. So my name is Sahara Reza. I use the pronouns she, her. I have the pleasure of working as interim project manager for the National Right to Housing Network. And I'd like to acknowledge that I am calling in from the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and many Anishinaabeg peoples here in a town colonially known as Alliston, Ontario. And this land acknowledgement is meaningful in the context of today's conversation because we know that Indigenous peoples are disproportionately impacted by homelessness and inadequate housing across Canada, both on and off reserve. And that is a major systemic issue that's rooted in legacies of colonial displacement, dislocation, ongoing inadequate investment in Indigenous communities, and in systems of oppression like racism, sexism, ableism, and so on, which continue to intersectionally harm communities. And so realizing the right to housing for all is deeply intertwined with combating those systems of oppression and advancing the human rights of Indigenous peoples, including the right to self-determination. And that is something as a housing advocate that I never want to lose sight of. And so I encourage everyone here today to also reflect on your connection to the land, to the settler colonial history and ongoing relationships of that land, and how this understanding can inform your commitment to and solidarity with Indigenous calls for action and justice. And in keeping with that anti-colonial and human rights-based framework, I also want to point folks towards our safe space guidelines for NRHN events, which my colleagues will pop the link for into the chat right now. And it essentially just reiterates our shared commitment as participants in this event to maintain a respectful and anti-oppressive environment. All right, so that moves us on to the agenda. Could I get the next slide, please? Fabulous. So we'll just quickly give you a rundown of what we can expect today. I will first very briefly introduce the National Right to Housing Network, which played an integral role in the right to housing being legislated in Canada. Then we will hear from the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, who are co-hosting this event with us, and they will speak about how they are applying the right to housing in their work. We'll then get to enjoy a fireside chat with our new federal housing advocate, Marie-Josée Houle, to get to know her, her role, her priorities, and how we can all work together to ensure that the right to housing is made a reality. And then we will open it up to everybody here today so that you can ask your questions directly to Marie-Josée, although of course you can do that throughout the event in the chat. Okay, so to start, we can end the slides here. I hope you're not bored with me yet, because while I've introduced myself, I am just a tiny piece of the National Right to Housing Network. And this network really has an incredible story behind it, which I wanted to share with you folks today. Because before we became a formal network of over 350 partners, as well as thousands of supporters across the country, we were an informal network of organizations, advocates, and human rights experts from across the housing and homelessness sector who were simply unwilling to accept the human rights crisis of homelessness, and especially in such a wealthy nation like Canada. And these folks had been trying to advance systemic solutions for decades, both through courts and other means. And in fact, in 2012, there was a landmark court case, the Tanujaja case, which was brought forward in Ontario courts to argue that homelessness is an egregious violation of Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and that our government must implement a strategy to address homelessness. But despite extensive support from organizations, experts, and people with lived experience across the sector, including over 10,000 pages of evidence submitted, the Ontario Court of Appeals ruled in a highly controversial decision that homelessness is just too complex and beyond the mandate of the courts. And so the case was dismissed in 2014. But that just served as a catalyst for civil society to redouble its efforts to further mobilize at a community level, to collaborate with lived experience and government stakeholders, and even to draft the early stages of the National Housing Strategy Act, which in 2019 was finally adopted by our federal government for the first time in Canadian law. And it recognized that adequate housing is a fundamental human right essential to the inherent dignity and well-being of the person. And this legislation is significant because it requires that Canada implement the right to housing as described in international law, which already has extensive guidelines laid out. And under those guidelines, affected communities who are actually experiencing housing rights violations must always be engaged and centered in all housing decisions, policies, and investments so that we are actually addressing the deepest systemic issues that cause homelessness and inadequate housing. And so this is why our network eventually became formalized in 2020. And our entire mandate is two-pronged. First, we work to hold the federal government accountable to their legal obligations under the NHSA so that this right to housing is meaningfully implemented. And second, we work to build a grassroots community, infrastructure, and culture that supports the right to housing, because this right to housing will only become real if people understand what it means and they have the knowledge and supports they need to claim it and to hold their governments accountable to it. But luckily, we are not alone in this mission. The National Housing Strategy Act itself created many important and independent mechanisms for accountability and oversight. And that includes the role of the federal housing advocate, who is Marie-Josée Houle, and she is responsible for reviewing systemic human rights issues related to housing. And so we will shortly hear directly from Marie-Josée about her role, her priorities, and how we can collaborate across sectors to ensure that everyone has access to safe, adequate, and affordable housing. But before we do, I just want to pass it off to my co-host for this event and one of our key partners here, Caitlin Schwan from the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, which is doing some amazing work that really exemplifies what a rights-based approach could mean for marginalized groups like women and gender diverse people. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Caitlin.
Thank you so much, Sahar. We are tremendously thrilled to be here, to be co-hosting this event with the National Right to Housing Network, and to be just offering a tremendously warm welcome to our new federal housing advocate, Marie-Josée. Thanks so much for being here with us. My name's Caitlin Schwann. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm calling in from the traditional and unceded territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabeg, and the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation, colonially known as Guelph, Ontario. I wanted to provide everyone a bit of a background on what we're up to at the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. We are a diverse collective from across Canada that is working to end homelessness and housing precarity for women and gender diverse folks. And you can check us out at womenshomelessness.ca. We'd love to have you join us. In our work, we've really been focused on research, on community engagement, and on policy change in order to advance the right to housing for women and gender diverse people. And a big component of that is centering the voices of folks with lived expertise. So I'm so thrilled to see so many of you here today. Our hope with the National Housing Strategy Act and our wonderful federal housing advocate is that this will be a really critical moment to advance a more equitable housing system that's going to result in adequate housing for all people across Canada, and certainly prioritizing those who are suffering the most in our current strategy and approach to housing. So what we are trying to do at the network is mobilize this new legislation to address some of the gendered forms of right to housing violations. And I know that probably sounds kind of abstract, but in concrete terms, when we're talking about violations of the right to housing for women and gender diverse people, we're talking about things like the continual apprehension of children from their mothers because of their housing status or their poverty, definitions of homelessness and affordable housing that end up excluding women and gender diverse folks that do not reflect gendered realities, and leave women and gender diverse people unable to access housing and supports, particularly if they have disabilities. It also looks like the kind of chronic underfunding of Indigenous women's housing and services, and the failure to act on the calls to justice under the Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. And across the country, as all of you will know, we're also seeing the financialization of housing and its disproportionate impact on racialized and low-income women and households, trapping them in situations of precarity and abuse. So these kind of rights violations mean that women and gender diverse folks are experiencing some of the deepest forms of core housing need across the country, and often remaining trapped in situations of hidden homelessness. So when we're talking about the housing crisis, when we're talking about the right to housing, the work that we do is really trying to point out that this is also a gendered crisis, and it's really an issue of equity and equality. And while our network is focused on gender and its intersections, I would just encourage anyone who's here representing your community, or here as an individual or as a group, to really think about how you can use this legislation to advance housing justice for your community. We're looking at it through a gendered lens, but there is a huge opportunity for groups to be using this new legislation and the wonderful work of the federal housing advocate in the years to come. And our hope is that this town hall will be an opportunity for us to have some of these preliminary conversations about how to make use of this legislation, and to kind of get some information and tools into your hands. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Sahar. So thrilled to be here.
Sorry, folks. I think some folks were having issues with interpretation. So can you, I think I fixed it. Let me know if there are still issues. If not, Matthew will fix it on our back end. Thank you for your patience. And thank you, Caitlin, for your work at the network. It really embodies the human rights principles in practice, just the way that your network even operates. And it shows us how we can actually apply the NHSA and the right to housing to drive forward systemic change. And so to tie this all together now, I would like to introduce the woman of the hour who we are all here to meet, our new and first ever federal housing advocate, Miss Marie-Josée. And her appointment marks a new chapter in a career defined by her work in the affordable housing and homelessness sector. She is an experienced leader who is recognized for her community activism, her expertise in human rights, and her extensive knowledge of the housing and homelessness system. Most recently, she was the executive director of Action Logement, an Ottawa-based housing loss prevention organization. Her diverse experience in the housing sector spans development consulting and project management for affordable housing developments. She's advocated for tenant rights at all 3 levels of government and has worked with diverse partners to address human rights violations related to housing and homelessness. And in particular, building a sense of community and supporting and amplifying marginalized voices is very important to her. And so, Marie-Josée, I would love to invite you now to the floor to say hello, and thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much. It really means a lot, especially this particular audience. And I'm looking at the chat and I'm looking at everyone's introductions, and I'm really thrilled to see a really broad and diverse audience today. So thank you so much for coming. And I'm hearing my introduction and I'm always like, who is this person you're talking about? You know, this is, wow, she must be lying or something. But I've been incredibly blessed to have such a diverse experience. And so I'm able to speak to a lot of issues from a lot of different perspectives. And now in my role, well, I get to spend the afternoon with you, and this means a lot. I also want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, which is a gift really for me that's incredibly meaningful. So thanks for having me.
Brilliant. Thank you. And Caitlin, I think you're going to start us off with the questions. Go ahead.
Absolutely, I will. We have some really interesting ones for you, Marie-Josée. So excited to have you here with us. So to start us off, you know, as the federal housing advocate, you have a critical role to play in terms of holding governments accountable for the right to adequate housing. So our question for you is, you know, what does the right to adequate housing really mean in practice? So for folks who are homeless, for people who are in housing need or living in inadequate housing, how does this new legislation and recognition of the right to housing concretely help them?
Well, first of all, I want to say that I've spent 18 years, you know, working with people, directly with people. So we all know too well what it looks like when the right to adequate housing is not upheld. And the result, it results in homelessness, overcrowding, living in unsanitary conditions, without security of tenure, being bullied by your landlord. Inadequate housing and homelessness are generally affect groups that are already disadvantaged, and they are in vulnerable situations. Inadequate housing and homelessness create barriers to enjoying other essential human rights, such as, you know, such as being a full participant in society and actually living in dignity. The National Housing Strategy Act has recognized housing as a fundamental human right for everyone in Canada. As you've heard, you know, this was spoken to by Sahar. She opened up the, you know, the meeting today. And it's more than just about, you know, supply. It's more than just 4 walls and a roof. It is about human dignity, and everyone has the right to live in a safe, secure, affordable home that meets their needs and to be free from discrimination or harassment. And governments have an obligation to provide that. The right to adequate housing is also an important precondition for many other human rights, including the right to life, work, physical and mental health, social security, political participation, education, and the right to a healthy environment. The right to adequate housing also means that everyone has a right to housing that meets really in the law, you know, a definition, and which includes seven conditions related to security of tenure, affordability, habitability, you know, that provide basic services that are located in an area that is close to employment, and basic social services need to be accessible and culturally appropriate. So when it comes to the right to housing for Indigenous people, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples reaffirm the right to self-determination, rights related to land, resources, and territories, social inclusion, and the importance of Indigenous peoples' right to determine their own housing institutions, programs, and policies. And governments have made commitments to respect, protect, and fulfill this right. And the National Housing Strategy Act invites everyone in Canada to hold governments accountable for the obligation to prioritize the needs of the most disadvantaged, using maximum available resources to provide adequate housing for all in the shortest possible time. Today's housing crisis, now, I firmly believe that a national focus on the right to adequate housing is the only way we can change the focus and dig ourselves out of the hole we find ourselves in. Housing is not a commodity. Housing is more than just a need, and governments, industry, housing providers, and the public must understand that housing is our human right.
Thank you so much, Marie-Josée. It's really nice to hear you, you know, say it in those beautiful words, and know that you get the right to housing even better than we do, I think. So that's fabulous. So wanted to follow up on that, because Canada first committed to the right to housing when it was ratified in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in 1977. But unfortunately, this international commitment didn't translate into concrete action when it comes to upholding the right within Canada. And so I'm wondering, how does your role change the equation and enable you to hold the government accountable? And what power does your role have? What does it not have? Could you elaborate a bit for us?
Certainement. En tant que défenseur fédéral du logement, je considère que mon rôle, c'est d'amplifier la voix des personnes qui vivent dans des logements inadéquats et qui sont sans abri, et et de susciter les changements systémiques afin que les lois, les politiques et les programmes gouvernementaux respectent le droit à un logement adéquat. Pour jouer ce rôle, c'est important de souligner que mon poste en tant que défenseur fédéral du logement est indépendant du gouvernement, et que même si mon personnel est basé à la Commission canadienne des droits de la personne, je suis indépendante de la Commission. Pour tenir les gouvernements responsables, la défenseur est investie dans un certain nombre de devoirs et de fonctions qui sont définies dans la loi sur la stratégie nationale en matière de logement. Je suis chargée de surveiller si le Canada s'acquitte de ses obligations en matière de réalisation progressive du droit à un logement adéquat, tel que défini dans le droit international, notamment dans la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme, et de surveiller si la stratégie nationale sur le logement atteint ses objectifs et adopte une approche fondée sur les droits de la personne. À ce propos, je me soumettrai sous peu mon premier rapport annuel qui contiendra d'importantes recommandations sur la matière dont la stratégie nationale doit être révisée pour s'aligner sur la loi, en fait. Je peux entreprendre des recherches et des études pour mieux comprendre les problèmes systémiques de logement. Avant mon arrivée, mon équipe a commandé des recherches sur la financiarisation du logement, la sécurité d'occupation et d'expulsion, les campements, ainsi qu'une analyse de la stratégie nationale sur le logement fondée sur les droits de la personne. L'une de mes tâches, mais aussi, à mon avis, une condition de réussite, est de consulter avec des membres de groupes défavorisés, des personnes ayant une expérience vécue de besoin de logement et qui ont vécu de l'itinérance. au cours de plus de 2 mois qui sont écoulés depuis ma nomination. Ça, c'est 2 mois hier. J'ai eu le privilège aussi de rencontrer certains de ces groupes et d'apprendre d'eux, mais cela restera une priorité pour moi tout au long de mon mandat. Entre autres, dans le cadre de toutes mes fonctions, j'aimerais reconnaître l'importance d'établir les relations respectueuses avec les Inuits, les Métis et les Premières Nations d'un océan à l'autre. Je reconnais que je ne serais pas en mesure de faire face aux problèmes de logement des Autochtones si je ne suis pas en mesure d'établir des partenariats solides avec les organisations autochtones nationales et les organisations dirigées par les Autochtones. Je suis également chargée de recevoir des soumissions concernant les problèmes systémiques de logement de la part des membres du public ou des organisations. J'ai le plaisir d'annoncer que nous lançons très bientôt un portail de soumission d'un mécanisme de plainte individuelle. Et je ne suis pas en mesure de résoudre des problèmes individuels, mais ces soumissions vont permettre aux gens de partout au pays de partager leurs histoires et de m'aider à comprendre les problèmes au Canada. Nous serions également en mesure de recevoir des soumissions par courriel, par la poste ou par téléphone. Et les personnes qui souhaitent présenter une soumission peuvent également obtenir du soutien par l'intermédiaire de Service Canada. Nous sommes impatients de partager avec vous de plus informations sur les soumissions à venir et nous envisagerons de planifier un webinaire avec vous. Alors, cette loi, c'est un nouveau mécanisme de responsabilisation au Canada. Je peux entreprendre mon propre examen d'un vaste problème systémique de logement ou de partager ou de demander au Conseil national de l'habitation de mettre sur pied un comité d'examen qui tiendra une audience pour examiner tout problème systémique en logement de juridiction fédérale. Les conclusions et les recommandations formulées par moi-même ou par le comité d'examen permettront de trouver des solutions et de procéder aux réformes nécessaires des lois, des politiques, les programmes, les méthodes d'implémentation qui ont une incidence sur le logement et l'itinérance au Canada. Et ces mécanismes est un moyen de cibler les problèmes systémiques les plus critiques et d'exhorter le gouvernement à prendre des mesures à leur égard. Elle donne également aux membres de la communauté touchée l'occasion d'être plus inclus et de participer au processus et de contribuer à la politique et aux solutions en matière de logement. Enfin, et non, et certainement pas le moindre, la loi me charge de fournir des conseils, de soumettre des rapports au ministre. Et j'ai compris mon prochain rapport annuel. Bien que le gouvernement ne soit pas tenu de suivre mes conseils, mes rapports seront rendus publics et le ministre devrait y répondre. En tant que défenseur fédéral du logement, il se peut que les fonctions ne suffisent pas à elles seules à susciter les changements nécessaires à la réalisation du droit du logement dans ce pays. Cependant, en travaillant avec vous et en collaborant avec les gouvernements, les organisations autochtones nationales, les universitaires, l'industrie et les personnes ayant une expérience vécue, je m'attends à ce que mon mandat puisse influencer les changements nécessaires aux politiques et aux programmes afin d'assurer qu'ils font progresser le droit au logement pour ceux qui en ont plus besoin.
Thank you so much, Marie-Josée. So wonderful to hear you emphasizing the deeply collaborative approach that you're taking to the work you do, and for everyone to have a better understanding kind of your role and the powers within that. Thank you. You know, building on that, something we've been thinking about certainly at the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network is that the right to adequate housing isn't really well understood. So the definition of adequate housing under human rights law and in the Canadian definition of homelessness includes an understanding of precarious housing like overcrowding, and as well as invisible homelessness, which we know women and gender diverse folks are more represented in. So there are these more robust definitions, but despite that, many people living in Canada may not know that they have the right to housing, to live in better conditions. So my question to you is, what role do you see your office as playing in doing some of that education work and that empowerment work for people who may not realize they have the right to housing, and that it may be being violated?
I saw this a lot when I was working on the ground as well. And, the systemic and sustainable change aren't possible without greater understanding and recognition of the right to adequate housing at all levels across the country. Rights holders need to understand their human rights before they can be equipped to effectively make demands. And duty bearers in government must understand and recognize their obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill the right to adequate housing. The housing industry, finance sector, and housing service providers must also recognize their responsibilities. So as federal housing advocate, my monitoring, research, engagement, and reviews provide opportunities to deepen our understanding and spread awareness of the right to housing. And to be honest, I'm still learning like everyone else. Every chance I get, I want to engage and speak out, and to provide an opportunity to reinforce the message that housing is not a commodity. It is a human right. I talk about, whispers, and I talk about, sending it out to the ether, and so that it just becomes so commonplace, and that it just becomes completely natural that every time someone talks about housing, housing is a human right rolls off the tongue. So, contributing to the empowerment of rights holders is not just about education, though. It also means creating spaces for rights holders, particularly people with lived experience, who are sharing their realities and are proposing the solutions. It also means creating safe spaces where duty bearers are listening to and are engaged in real dialogue with people with lived experience. So my team and I, we aim to integrate these approaches in all of our work, but we can't do it alone. And we need partnerships with you and with many others. I can use my protection and my position, and the leverage that comes with it to open up spaces, hopefully to provide some useful tools. But the critical work of equipping rights holders to fight for their right to housing, well, it's a collective responsibility. I'm also very concerned, about the mechanisms of responsibility. And, later on, and we've got some questions to ask you. We want to hear from you. But I'm also hoping that you'll dig deep, because my experience on the ground is to shoulder that responsibility. I think with the inequity of power in the landlord-tenant relationship, I find that a lot of the laws are based on people who are the right holders, that they shoulder the responsibility of standing up for their rights. And I want you to think about, what would it look like if that responsibility was shared a little bit more equally? That in these mechanisms of enforcement, that it includes the oppressor or not the victim to always have to stand, because it's exhausting, and it's not everyone who has it in them. And I'm really glad that we have advocates, but even then, even with free legal advice or free legal support, or with the voice of advocates, it's sometimes just not enough. So I'm going to talk about that a little later, but I did want to bring that up at this point.
Yeah, thank you, Marie-Josée. It's true. Often I mention when we speak about the right to housing that we need to remember that the government actually has obligations to us. It's not that we only have obligations to raise our issues, but like it's a mutual relationship. And I think that's what the right to housing framework really brings back to the forefront, is that dialogic back and forth approach. Okay, so this brings me to our next question, because you touched on individual claims that folks often are faced with in landlord-tenant situations. But your mandate actually focuses on systemic issues. And so I'm wondering, how are you going to be identifying and prioritizing systemic issues? What are some of the major systemic issues that are currently on your office's radar? And what do you hope to see achieved within, say, the first year of your tenure and perhaps during the full 3 years of your tenure?
Well, and this is so sobering when I think about the timeline, because 3 years, it's not a lot. It really isn't, but we're going to make the most of these 3 years. And so, as I've talked about, my duties are largely defined as addressing systemic issues and not responding to individual complaints or situations. However, the National Housing Strategy Act does not provide a definition of systemic housing issue. So we had to start by developing our own definition. So for the purpose of interpreting my duties and functions, a systemic housing issue is an issue which inhibits the full and equal enjoyment of the right to adequate housing in Canada and is rooted in the housing system or other public and private market systems. And as directed by the Act, I'll prioritize systemic issues affecting disadvantaged groups and people experiencing inadequate housing or homelessness. We're still developing our analytical tools. However, we're looking at building from the definitions focus on human rights. And the first lens we propose to use when we prioritize issues will be their human rights dimension, including severity of impact, breadth of impacts, and priority groups. Following the human rights screening, we'll do an assessment based on strategic impact, opportunity to affect housing system, and other processes underway, issues of jurisdiction, and unfortunately our capacity. We are a mighty team of 10, not including myself. So to date, we haven't had time to declare any clear priority issues. In fact, I need to hear from you and all of you who are working on the ground and people with lived experience before I can really truly land on the priorities. And that's why the upcoming discussion is so important to me. Our submission tools will be important as we prioritize issues, and I look forward to hearing from some of you through the use of this tool. In the meantime, we are continuing to work to build on what was undertaken last year by my colleagues at the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate in the following areas. So through our monitoring and engagement work, we've commissioned research on financialization, evictions and security of tenure, encampments, and aligning the National Housing Strategy with the National Housing Strategy Act, including following the money for the most recent budget. And through the work, we've begun to develop our monitoring framework. We're looking at inadequate housing and homelessness for people with disabilities. It's a key priority for me to build relationships and engage with Indigenous organizations, and we'll develop priorities in these areas in dialogue with them. I also understand that we need to recognize that the right to housing intersects with a wide range of social concerns. So working with gender on the gender dimension of inadequate housing and homelessness is of critical importance. And I recognize that housing intersects with other forms of disadvantage and discrimination, including colonialism, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and ableism, and stigmatization or discrimination based on poverty, homelessness, and social condition. So when identifying priorities, I intend to include this analysis. I'll need to build connections to other sectors to effectively take on these challenges and engage with other government departments beyond the ones traditionally associated with housing.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Marie-Josée. And I'm seeing a lot of brilliant questions come in. So, and I want to emphasize to everyone what Marie-Josée just said. They are still in the process of determining what should be priorities. So here's an opportunity in the chat and in this conversation coming up to share your thoughts, share your questions, share what's happening in your community in the chat, and it's going to be documented and reviewed by the office. So one final question for you, if that's okay, and then we're going to head right into the Q&A. So certainly, as you know, housing issues are interjurisdictional. They cut across municipal, provincial, territorial, and federal jurisdictions. So we're wondering, what role do you see creating change at all of those levels of governments and kind of addressing the diversity of housing challenges that we're facing at the municipal level, the federal level, across these jurisdictions?
Well, this is tricky. But, you know, first and foremost, we know that housing issues span all three levels of government, all levels of government, regardless of where you're living. And, you know, it's why this housing crisis has been just so complex. Who do we address? You know, people will usually run to their, you know, the municipal councilor's office because they're the ones that are so, they're first, you know, they're there, they're in their cities, they're close to people. And yet, you know, they'll point upwards. And I've seen levels of government point at each other, and it's been maddening, quite frankly. And, but it is, you know, supporting the human right to adequate housing for all is actually a shared responsibility between all levels of government. And the shared responsibility is also enshrined. It's enshrined in international law that all levels of government in Canada are required to respect, protect, and fulfill the human right to adequate housing, since in international human rights treaties and obligations apply equally at the federal, provincial, and territorial level. And so progressive realization of the right to adequate housing means that there is recognition that change will happen over time, but that all duty bearers are expected to act immediately and to implement the right. Therefore, while I'm responsible for making recommendations regarding systemic housing issues within federal jurisdiction to the Federal Minister of Housing and Diversity and Inclusion, provincial, territorial, and municipal jurisdictional responsibilities, they're going to be identified in these recommendations as well. I'll be engaging with provincial, territorial, municipal governments to discuss how we can work together to advance the right to adequate housing in Canada by mobilizing all available resources through all appropriate means, including policy and legislation within their jurisdiction. I think too, you know, as we, you know, all of my reports will be sent to the minister, but they're going to be deposited in Parliament. And in Parliament, you know, they will have, you know, will have an impact on the other sectors. And, you know, and I think we've identified a few, but as we keep looking, we're realizing that there's going to be others that maybe aren't quite as obvious. So I'm pretty excited to see how far this goes. But, you know, this housing crisis doesn't happen in a silo. And it doesn't happen on its own. And none of the solutions are going to come from one, and there is no magic bullet either. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Marie-Josée. And a lot of the comments are also speaking to that need for cross-sectoral collaboration and cross-departmental collaboration. So to that end, actually, I would like to open up the floor now to all of the folks who are so actively participating in the Q&A and the chat. So before I do, just some very quick housekeeping notes that we ask everyone to please stay on mute. Actually, I'm not even sure if you can unmute yourself without us, so that's great. But yeah, until we have called upon you in the open forum. And then we also ask that you please use the hand raising function to indicate that you would like to address Marie-Josée. The comments and stories we would suggest remain in the chat, whereas if you have a comment that is more systemic and is framed as a question for our advocate, then please do raise your hand now, and we would love to hear those verbally. Staff will receive the entire chat log at the end of the event, so it's a great space to share your concerns and comments if we don't get to them verbally right now. I also ask that we keep all comments to 2 minutes because, again, we have over 100 attendees. We want everyone to have a chance to participate. And so we will unfortunately but politely have to intervene at the 2-minute mark if they start to go over. And I think that's about it. Correct, Caitlin? So Caitlin will be moderating this Q&A. Thank you.
Fantastic. So we have a few things going on. We have folks in the chat and in the Q&A and in the hand raising. All of that is great. I'm going to do my best to coordinate across these, and my wonderful colleague Khulud is going to help. So maybe we'll start with a hand raise and kind of go through these. I see Jewel. Jewel, do you want to pose your question? I'm just
unmuting there. Can you hear me?
Sure can.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It is wonderful to finally connect with you, Marie-Josée. I'm Jewel Smith, and I just want to raise a question that very much impacts disabled mothers in Canada. I completed and defended my dissertation last autumn, and I interviewed disabled mothers across the country on human rights experiences across the board. But one of the really large issues that came up was access to safe, affordable, accessible housing to parent. So we know in the housing work that many of us on this call do, that often accessible housing is limited to one room in the house being accessible or the main floor being accessible and not accessible for a parent to raise their children. And I want to just share, I experienced such heartbreaking stories shared with me about women who couldn't cook the children's food, who had fears of over surveillance and looking like bad parents because their housing wasn't accessible for them. And so my question to you is, how are you going to bring that truly intersectional lens that includes things like the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, including Article 23 and Article 19 and Article 9 and 6, which are housing, women, and right to family, just so you have that in case those are not top of mind. How are you going to ensure that that lens is brought forward? Because we know in the disability movement that this particular conversation gets dropped over and over. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that question. You know, there's a lot of complexity in the lived experience of people. And it's something that I was always frustrated by. You know, I worked as a housing provider. I was a developer of affordable housing. And in that experience, you know, we, especially around accessibility, there's the code, but it can't just stop there. And, you know, some of the things I experienced on the ground as well is, as the city of Ottawa had adopted a gender or women and gender diverse lens, you know, I had a feeling they didn't quite realize exactly what that would mean in terms of housing. So one of the things I encountered that I couldn't wait for them to be faced with is being challenged on the provincial definition of what is an appropriate or a valid offer of housing for people, you know, on the wait list for RGIs. Or subsidized housing, because, you know, what is, you know, the provincial definition is based on household composition, and that's it. And, and we know that housing, you know, what is considered safe housing or appropriate housing for women with young children, for women with disabilities, or women in the situation that you've described. It changes from one person to another. So it really is about making sure that the definition of adequate is present at all of the enforcement levels, all of the application levels, and to make sure that that is upheld.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Marie-Josée, I see we have a number of questions. Would you prefer I pose you them one by one, or to have a few at a time? Do you have a preference?
Let's go one by one. I feel like a little like,
Okay.
it's like, I'm I'm not
Great.
sure that I'm equipped to lump them together, but if you find common threads as well, we're on the fly here. So
Okay, great. Okay, no, we'll go one by one for sure. That's wonderful.
okay.
So I have a question here in the chat from Mira. In BC, there have been 2 judgments that support homelessness encampments. This resulted in the provincial government putting some money towards foods and toilets for encampments. Yay, super yay. How significant are these court judgments for establishing the right to housing?
When I first started thinking about encampments, I was thinking that we don't have that in Canada. And then I really thought about it. I did my master's degree in Halifax. So, this is like the raising of encampments. Africville in Halifax is a significant stain on the Haligonian history. So this is nothing new. And then I'm reminded that people live in improvised housing all over the world. And, and that is a result of so many things. But it's the heavy-handed way that people are removed for the improvised housing. And it's not just, corrugated metal on top of a few pieces of plywood. It is people living on boats, that are, and this is something that's crossed my path recently as well. And then it's always framed, the part that I have the most difficulty with is always framed of people that are dangerous, people that are criminals are living in improvised housing. And that's not the case at all. But it is a place where community is built. So we definitely have to put that discussion and all the research in front of people to be able to have a proper conversation around it and look at how rights must be upheld. So knowing that there's case law, knowing that there's precedents is also going to be very important in our work, because we cannot sue governments. It's going to be through dialogue, but if we can point to case law, this is going to be an important tool for us.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Thank you so much. We also have a question here. I would like to know what the new housing advocate has to say regarding the opioid crisis and its ties to homelessness and appropriate supported housing.
Oh, well, I know I'm going to be asked this question next week when I talk to Canadian Housing and Renewal Association at their conference around supportive housing. Supportive housing is incredibly necessary for some people. And what I'm continually frustrated about, coming from Action Logement, is a housing loss prevention organization. And of course, then and now I'm interested in not just, having people housed and being adequately housed, but in successful tenancies. That if people want to stay in the communities and the homes that they're in, how can we make sure that they are able to stay? And for some people, it will mean supports. But the support programs that I know of, come with all kinds of conditions or timelines, or that, first of all, they're in short supply. There's not enough. And they're not flexible enough because people's needs are very different. But they also, if there's a time frame, yay, congratulations, you get our help for a year. And then after that, you should never need our help ever again. And that's not true. I was always fascinated by the people who came back to Action Logement after a few years after their housing situation had been stabilized, and we were considered light touch. So, and yet people came again, and what happened in their lives where their housing stability or housing situation had been destabilized, and then recognizing that some people will forever need supports, and we should be okay with that. So we need programs that are adequately funded, that are accessible to people, and that will meet them in their journey and supply the need or supply the support for as long as they actually need it, and that they're accessible again, should they need it again, and that it's not humane, nor is it fiscally appropriate to wait till they lose absolutely everything, lose their home, their possessions, their community, their friends. When people are going through eviction and they end up in shelters, it's a source of shame. It strips them of their dignity, and because of the shame, they they cut themselves off from their friends and family as well. So we can't wait till people reach that point before we go, oh, okay, we'll find you a spot with supports, you know, and I think everything's in short supply. That's going to be the biggest challenge, but we have to do better.
Absolutely. And I see lots of folks in the chat emphasizing this need to be proactive rather than reactive. Thank you so much. Okay, so we have Saul. Saul, do you want to pose your question to the advocate?
Yes, this is Sal Amenta. I'm from Stouffville, and I'm concerned about how high a priority it is for you as our advocate to provide accessible housing for seniors and persons with disabilities when they face, I would say, insurmountable systemic exclusion from available housing, that they have no alternative but to transition to institutional long-term care. And that violates their right to age in place. Shouldn't there be a high priority for Canada's rapidly aging population in the work that you will do?
Thank you for bringing that to my attention. You know, on the ground, we've been talking about the gray wave. What does that mean? And yet I'm not, you know, especially in terms of housing, not seeing that at all. When I was working as a developer, we had, an approach about universal design. And I know CMHC is really pushing universal design as well, so that regardless of people's needs or as their needs change, in terms of accessibility, that the conversions are easier, less costly, and can happen a lot quickly. So, you know, even if someone ends up in seniors housing and has, in a seniors community, like a seniors co-op, for example, like the one that I helped build a few years ago, you know, there was a thought of how is their life going to change, and how is their body going to change? And are they still going to be able to continue to be part of this community? And we've seen the evidence that, you know, living in the community and being part of something and having friendships and having connection with people help them live independently that much longer. And Sal, like, you know, in terms of dignity and autonomy is very, very important. So again, I feel like a broken record sometimes, where I don't want to give you a canned answer, but it really is about being proactive. And it's not like we haven't seen this coming. So it's certainly on our radar. The challenge is really, and I'm going to be very honest with all of you, the challenge is that there's a lot of priorities, and we've got our screening tool. Our biggest challenge is going to be, what are the first issues that we're going to be looking at? And I have 3 years. So we're going to do the best we can. And it's the same thing with the National Housing Council. I had a meeting with them yesterday, and, you know, it's weighing on us a lot.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Okay, I think we'll move to Kate now. Kate, are you here with us?
Okay, I see I can unmute. All right. Yeah, I share with Sal the concern about accessibility. And there's no law in Canada requiring that any housing be accessible, even though a quarter of the population has a disability. And Angus Reid has done a poll and found that about 70% of the population want all new housing to have to be accessible, because either they need it themselves now, or they know they will in the future, or they have relatives and friends they can't even invite over for dinner because they can't get through the door. I'm in that situation. And I'm really worried. I'm 80 years old and I don't know where I'm going to go. My husband's 85. Are we going to end up on the street? I've had knee replacement. He's had 2 hip replacements, and it looks like he has to have another one. You can't get through our bathroom door with a walker. We're in an old condo. There's nowhere to go. But if we change the building codes right across the country, starting with the national, and require that all new housing, especially apartments and condos, have to be accessible, we could gradually improve things. Universal design will serve everybody, not just people with disabilities. So why don't we just see that universal design, all of us are going to need it someday, but it also helps, you know, people pushing strollers, people bringing in groceries, movers, people, doing renovations, whatever, just for heaven's sake, to make all new housing have to be accessible. And CMHC has done studies and found that it costs exactly the same to build a new apartment, accessible or not. So why are we not making them accessible? What is going on in builders' heads? Do they go to bed at night thinking, oh, I'm so glad I discriminated against and 25% of the population? Do they not care about 25%, well, 70% of their market? So you really wonder, no other group would ignore 25 or 70% of their market. Part of the problem is the roadblock between levels of government. We talk to the feds and they say, oh, you've got to talk to the municipality and the province. Then we talk to the province and they say, oh, you've got to talk to the feds, because until they change the national building code, we can't harmonize across the country, which is ridiculous. It's just to shut us up. You go to the municipality and they say, oh, you have to get the provincial building code changed. So none of them will take responsibility for anything. And that leaves people with disabilities of all ages, including kids and seniors, with nowhere to live. This contravenes all the human rights codes, the charter, and the UN declaration. And the human rights code is supposed to take precedence over all other laws, but every level of government is ignoring this, and we need action now.
First of all, I'm really sorry that you're getting the runaround. No one should have to go through this, but it happens. It happens all too much, and they get sent to another level of government, or you do a presentation to council or a committee, and then they say, wow, yes, you're right, that's a great idea. Not in our jurisdiction though, sorry, we're going to send it upstairs to the province. And then is there follow-up? What does that mean? It just means it's not our problem, or we're not making it our problem, even though we agree with you, we think you're right. With regards to accessibility, and I think what you're also talking about is visitability. The programs that I worked in as a developer for affordable housing, those were very clear criteria. The challenge, and I'm not making excuses here, is that what works, there's still a baseline. And then after that, it's on an individual level, what the individual needs are. And, in terms, I lived in Europe, and light switches are lower and electrical outlets are higher, and they're a lot more advanced in a lot of ways in some things, with regards to accessibility. We're getting rid of doorknobs, and we have levered handles now on housing that's being built, but it's not enough. And I'm not sure exactly how to answer your question fully to the point, to what it deserves to be answered, Kate. But we, at the Human Rights Commission, we are, expecting at any time an accessibility commissioner to be named. So there is certainly overlap with the accessibility department of the Human Rights Commission. And they do take on individual cases, and they do have the power to sue government, which is different from us. We don't have that power, but there's definitely going to be conversations between our two offices for sure.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that incredibly important question and comments, Kate. We have so many great questions, and it's a little overwhelming, but there's some really helpful questions and feedback from Edna. Edna, I'm happy to pose the question for you, but I'm wondering if maybe you would want to pose your question yourself.
Sure. Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you to the advocate. This is a first, and I'm really, really appreciative. And I want to echo what my colleague Kate had said. It's baffling why this is not a universal design is not being implemented because of the high population need. But going back to us as a Black agency who does frontline work. That's why I can truly appreciate the advocate's background in nonprofit work. So we are a grassroots organization. Majority of the communities that we support are homeless, unhoused, and intermittently housed communities. Those are individuals who've been released out of jails, people who, as a result of COVID, were thrown out by landlords, people who have been on the street for many, many years, people who have been discharged from shelters for many, many reasons, people who have left shelters on their own accord, or people who cannot find spaces. So we see all these individuals on the ground, and again, they hold intersectional identities. And so we're seeing these harms being committed against these marginalized communities, and yet we don't see the actions. So I'm tired of hearing about policies. I'm tired of hearing about, yes, you have this right. Well, I do have a right to be treated equally, yet I do hear being called the N-word and being called everything. So that does not negate my right. It doesn't stop people from calling me names, nor does it stop anti-Black racism. So at this point in my life, I want to see actions. What are the actions that the advocate is going to take and this office is going to take to ensure that we're actually getting housing built up, accessible housing built up, especially in the downtown core areas, and that, you know, that is accessible and affordable to communities. Right now, we are supporting two elder community members who are about to be thrown out of their housing, and they will end up on the streets, right? And so they have a limited budget per month that they can afford to rent, and they cannot afford to rent within the downtown area because it is so expensive. Most of our cities across Canada are very, very expensive, and me telling them go apply for housing, I know they will not get it because I have other clients who have been on waiting lists for 10, 15 years and are still not housed. So we need the actual structures. We need housing. We need housing that's accessible. We need housing that's affordable. And we need, most importantly, people who work in those housing that have been trained on anti-Black racism and hate. So we have to look at this from a multi-pronged lens, as these issues are not just occurring in isolation, right? And for Black people, I prioritize Black and Indigenous and 2 LGBTQ plus communities based on the data. I'm not saying that they're better off than anybody, or that they are more privileged than anybody, or they should be privileged over anybody. I'm just going by the data. I'm going by what I see on the ground. And those are the communities who I see on the ground. We have another community member that we are supporting who, is living with, disability and is on the street. So it is just heartbreaking to see this. So I need to see actions. And I echo what all my colleagues are saying. And, to the benefit of our government, I have to say thank you so much for really having the advocate here. So thank you so much to everybody. And I know I do sound like I'm rambling when I get passionate. I do lose track of the English language. So my apologies.
Oh, please don't apologize. I understand. I share your passion, and I share, it's maddening. I've used that word a lot, and we need, thank you for sharing everything with me. I don't know where to begin except for the fact that, a budget from the government has just been released, and for once, housing is front and center. That's great. Unfortunately, the conversation was about supply, and yes, we need supply, but my job is to make sure that it is the right supply. And that is where, broad strokes is making sure that the national housing strategy is actually in line with the act, that these programs that they're aiming to fund actually have, real affordability for people, that they have mandates around accessibility, that they have mandates, that it is very, very tailored and very specific so that it will target the people that need it the most. Because, the act clearly states that all resources must be prioritized as fast as possible to the people that need it the most. And that's what I'm hearing from you. It's not just the data, but I think when we talk about data, I always fear, because I've done it, written reports to the municipality that go up to the province, that go up to the federal government or federal agencies. How do you translate human lives in numbers? And so hearing you speak, Edna, you're giving examples, you're talking about human beings at the end, so yes, data, absolutely, but we need to have human stories around this too. Make it real, because I always get frustrated and say, do I need to write this report in blood? But even then, that's not human, right? It needs to be human at the end. So thank you. Thank you for all of your work too.
Thank you so much. Elaine, can we turn to you now?
Yes, sorry. It was just cool the unmute button came because I can't ever find it. It's only been 2 years, right? Thank you. I'll be quick. Thank you, Marie-Josée. It is such a breath of fresh air to have somebody say social condition, even if I don't agree with the language, but that means that you're sensitive to social class, that taboo topic in Canada. So my question to you is, how have you been, how do you imagine that you're going to ensure that social class is not kept out of conversations at tables and agendas? Because all my work is in social class, and trying to get people to even say it has been so profoundly difficult. And social condition, it doesn't address poverty, discrimination, historical and contemporary. That was my quick question.
Thank you. Well, we're learning, right? And every day there's a vocabulary that we're faced with that we need to, disseminate, that we need to share, agree on a definition, and the definition changes all the time. People will co-opt terms, and I'm seeing that a lot, is looking at the conversations around convoy and co-opting human rights language around some of this stuff too. Okay, I'm venturing into major political territory that could take us sideways very quickly, but that's not the intention here. But we, Elaine, your work in helping us understand different language or new language or language that's been misused is as important as my role is to make sure that we normalize housing as a human right. So we've got a lot of work to do. So thanks for bringing this to my attention.
Thank you. So we're running a little. We have 15 minutes or so. So I'm going to try to take 4 more questions, and so we have overlap in the hands and the chat. So we're going to do hands. So if you have not posed your question in the chat yet, feel free to do so. If we don't get to you, the advocate will be reviewing these. So I'm going to turn to you now, Carolyn.
Thank you. And thank you, Marie-Josée. I want to go back to the question you just raised of right supply and ask what role you see the Advocate's Office having in the review of the National Housing Strategy, which has been around for 5 years. It hasn't been changed since the adoption of the National Housing Strategy Act and the formal recognition of the right to housing. As you mentioned earlier, many of the programs, in fact, the majority of the money in the NHS doesn't go towards creating affordable housing for people who are in housing need, which is the goal. The average income of a household in housing need is $23,000. That equates to about $575 a month rent, not $3,000 a month rent. So what role do you see as the housing advocate having in a review of the National Housing Strategy, and what's the next steps for that?
Well, thanks for asking that question, Carolyn. And believe me, I've read your review of the budget and that of Steve Pomeroy, and we need people who are, in academia. We rely on you for that kind of analysis because we can't do it all. And we are commissioning research in a lot of different subjects. The National Housing Council has also commissioned research on the National Housing Strategy versus the Act, and it's work that we're continuing to do. We've got strong relationships with CMHC, but it is through the minister, with reports to the minister. It's going to be in our annual report. you know, bringing up these really difficult questions. And Carolyn, I worked in Ottawa, and I know that's where you are right now too. And we saw the, you know, the results. And unfortunately, when it comes to construction, you know, you have the program is created, and then it's released, and then there's uptake, and then by the time you get your ducks in a row and you go through, you know, site planning approval, and then you build the thing, it is 3 years, 2 years, and then you get to see what the rents are, and you're going, wow. And we've all done wow, you know, in Ottawa, because we've seen exactly what you described. And that definition of affordability is front and center, and it's a big confrontation. And even CMHC is saying, you know, what they're seeing is 5 different definitions, and we need to really keep on them so that they come down to an appropriate definition, an adequate definition of what affordability is, or remove the word affordability so that it's not regionally, you know, that it is, we're actually looking at core housing need. And, you know, because otherwise they're saying, well, it's the data or it's the privilege of living in a place, but you can't have a city where it's only the affluent that live there. Everyone needs, you know, every community needs people to serve coffee and pump gas and clean schools. And, you know, and cities is where we have resources, and we can't have the resources be, you know, unobtainable by people because they're not living close by. So.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Afosa.
Hi, thank you very much. I wasn't expecting to be called, but first of all, thank you to Sahar for the good work you're doing, and the other agency that you're working with, and to the Federal Housing Advocate. Congratulations on your appointment. I'm going to try and make my question building the context around it. I moved to Canada in 2017 as an immigrant, and I love Canada. I'm happy I'm here. I managed to save and put money aside for a down payment for pre-construction in May 2019. The developer is building here in Ottawa, had clauses in the contract where they could delay, you know, once, twice, 3 times, which was fine. They did so, delaying it 3 times from February 2020, when it was supposed to be delivered, to June 2020 till October 2020. In March 2020, when it was official that the pandemic was here, announced in Ontario, they triggered an unavoidable delay clause. Till today, the developer is yet to lay foundations in the ground. The developer has built about 45%, and the rest of the construction, they've informed home buyers like myself, is delayed indefinitely, okay? That's on one side. On the other side, you have home buyers who moved in to their houses and are having tons of quality issues in their houses. Now, I've filed a complaint with the HCRA, who's supposed to be regulating the developers, and I filed a complaint in July last year. Till today, they've not been able to come to any reasonable conclusion on the complaint or an investigation. So this leaves myself and other home buyers in a situation where, on one hand, we do not know if the builder is going to actually build. On the other hand, if they build, we don't know what quality we're going to get. And so my question to you is, or before I pose my question, the feeling is that even after paying for a house, you are still being denied that house. So the question to you is, how will your office, advocate office, intervene to enforce consumer protections for situations like this? Because we know that builders are coming back to home buyers and saying, bring 100,000 more, or else, you know, take your deposit back and you can walk. Builders are outrightly canceling developments only to carry on and sell them for significant profit. So nothing is happening on the provincial level, unfortunately. So what is going to be happening on the federal level? Because it's just not good enough. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your question, Fosta. And I'm really sorry about the delays in construction, or even just like you said, the insecurity of even knowing that you're going to have a home after waiting all this time. We know that home ownership has an impact on the entire housing spectrum, you know, in terms of supply, that people who, because home ownership has been out of reach for a lot of people, they stay in the rental market. But in the end, it is, you know, I think the financialization, not just in the investments in housing, but the whole entitlement of being able to make a huge, huge, huge profit on a fundamental need, whether it's home ownership or rental or single room occupancy or rooming houses, is there needs to be looked at very closely, because it's having an impact on everyone across the border. So, you know, as much as on the surface we could say, well, homeownership is not necessarily on our radar as much as people who are experiencing homelessness, but you are describing a situation where people are slipping through the cracks, and you're really pointing at the fact that anyone who's involved in the housing industry is in it and expecting a ridiculous amount of profit. And how appropriate is that? And we need to recenter that question. And in you know, again, filtering the question of housing as a human right, I think we are going to end up having that conversation as well. So thank you for bringing that to our attention.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have 2 more questions. Nat, go right ahead.
Hi, everybody. Thanks to the network for putting this on, and Marie-Josée, it's so great to finally meet with you. My name is Nat, and I'm here with my colleague Sarah, and we're representing the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies. Our organization takes on key issues impacting criminalized women and gender diverse people in Canada, including housing security. So what we see in our work is how systemic violations of the right to housing contributes to criminalization and recriminalization. And we also see how common practices in the criminal justice system contribute to barriers accessing safe and adequate housing. So we all know gender, of course, impacts our access to housing, and we know there's a lot of overlap between the known risk indicators for housing security and the risk indicators for involvement with the criminal justice system. Some of the barriers that someone who has been incarcerated can now face include, well, many people who are exiting prisons, they have no home to return to, they lack housing references, they have poor credit, and their employment may be disrupted. On the outside, discriminatory rental practices against those with criminal records persist despite tenant rights legislation. Certain bail, parole, and probation conditions may severely limit housing options. As a result, people might be released right into homelessness or may remain in prison despite being eligible for release. And lastly, sorry. I double read a line here, but anywho, so as we work together to realize the right to housing in this country, and we're so excited to work with you, it is critical that we recognize how criminalization specifically contributes to housing need in some of our most systemically marginalized groups, such as those people facing racism, colonialism, gender discrimination, ableism, etc. So our question to you, in your role as the federal housing advocate, is will you have the jurisdiction to investigate and make recommendations about systemic violations of the right to housing that are beyond the traditional boundaries of the housing sector? For example, would you be able to investigate how conditions of someone's parole or probation by federal courts might be violating their right to housing?
Ooh, that's a really great question. When we had this discussion this morning about, what our mechanisms are, it is about engaging. First of all, you're sharing this with me. You're sharing your concern. You're making sure that it's on our radar. And then we would, make recommendations. We might do a review. We might have a review done at the National Housing Council. I think we can also make comments, but everything we do will cross the minister's desk, and the minister has an obligation to respond. doesn't mean that we'll see action, but in that response, we are putting everything public, first of all. And second of all, some things will end up in Parliament. And in Parliament, that means that, you know, it will also be on the radar officially, and not just through us meeting with different, you know, ministries and ministers and deputy ministers and, you know, the provinces, territories, and regional governments. But, you know, so there will be an official mechanism where some of these issues that we're seeing and that we're commenting on will end up in Parliament. So they will end up in front of different ministers. So they're not just going to be buried on a minister in charge of housing on their desk. So it really is about awareness, amplifying, and then monitoring in the end. So if there is something that is actioned by governments, there is oversight on this, or lack of action for that matter as well. So it seems, like I said, we're not going to be tying up governments for decades in court. We don't have that mechanism, but it really is about amplifying and making them aware. And then to speak to this issue, people who are justice involved, you know, what I've seen in Ontario is that the human rights, Ontario human rights and discrimination in terms of access to housing does not cover people who are justice involved. So if a landlord unilaterally, and needed to do this across, you know, for every application, they are allowed to deny people housing with a criminal background, and or by doing a criminal background check, and that is not in line with the international law. So there's going to be a lot of things to challenge for sure.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Looking forward to seeing where your work heads over these next 3 years for sure.
Brilliant. Okay, I think that we will probably end our Q&A there, but just to remind you folks that feel free to, in the last couple minutes, throw anything in the chat that you want the office to see. This was incredibly rich and fascinating and important. Sahar, I'll turn it back to you to wrap up, but just to say I'm so grateful to all of you for being here, and tremendous gratitude to you, Marie-Josée, for being with us and thinking these questions through. We're so thrilled.
Yeah, I just want to echo Caitlin. Thank you everyone for joining us, for sharing your really thoughtful questions and comments, and for you, Marie-Josée, for responding so thoughtfully. I'm sure it's overwhelming, but it's so valuable to have an advocate like you in this position. So I just want to let everybody know as we wrap up that this is just the first of many more town halls and webinars and opportunities for engagement with the advocate. And so I believe my colleague Alex has put links in the chat for each network's website, for the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate's website. You can sign up for our newsletters, which is probably the best way to stay up to date with any engagement opportunities going forward. And I believe the next town hall will be centered in Quebec, though I believe anyone can join. So stay tuned for that as well. And otherwise, just thank you again, and we hope to see you all soon.
Thanks so much for having me. I look forward to seeing you as well. Thanks for all of your feedback, everyone. It is really invaluable to our work.
Thank you, Marie-Josée. All right, take care, everyone.
Bye, everyone.